We're going to get started. I hope you all are buckled up, because what you're about to hear is going to blow your mind. I've heard enough about what's to come to know that buckling up and putting on a helmet is probably what's needed. So my name is Ben Wayman. I'm the Andrews Chair in Christian Unity here at Greenville University, and in collaboration with a bunch of you all, so Mosaic and GSGA, and University 401, and my friend Paul Donnell, we were able to bring Mark Charles to campus today. You all have heard from him in chapel. Many of you heard from him yesterday in Early Christianity, my methods class and my Early Christianity class. We had Q&A with him, with Chick-fil-A over lunch, and now we are going to dive into the Doctrine of Discovery. So briefly, Mark Charles is the son of an American woman of Dutch heritage and a Navajo man, and he is a national speaker and writer regarding modern history. He serves as the Washington, D.C. correspondent and regular columnist for Native News Online, and is currently writing a book that's being called Unsettling Truths. The earlier title was Truth Be Told, which he had a personal connection with, but his editor has moved him in a new direction. Most importantly for you all, Mark is a Christian. And he reads the Gospels with a keen sense of the revolutionary nature of the Christian faith. And what we're about to hear today is a powerful message. It's an unsettling message, but it's one that demands our attention. Would you please welcome Mark Charles?
Well, Yate. It's very good to be back with you. I think I've met everyone here, so I don't need to go through my introduction again. But I do want to just acknowledge, again, some of the lands that we're on. And let me bring up my... Hold on just a second. Just acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Osete, Sequin, the Sioux, and the Miami, and the Osage. And again, it's just important to keep in front of us that we are on lands that were not discovered, that we are on lands that were taken and people were removed so that cities like Greenville, towns like Greenville could be built, even this university could be established. And it helps us to maintain a deeper sense of humility if we keep that in the forefront of our minds at all times. In the next hour and a half, I am going to give you some information on the history of both the church and the nation that for many of you will be shocking. I will say some things that will offend probably most everybody in the room. At some point you will want to stand up and walk out. At other points you may want to throw something at me. Resist both those urges. But stay in your seat, stay engaged, stay connected. We're going to get to a better place, but we first have to deconstruct a lot of mythology and uncover a lot of history that we don't know how to talk about. And before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that there are people in this field who have been working hard to bring these issues to the forefront. And one of them is an author. He's a Shawnee and Lenape. His name is Steve Newcomb. And he's published a book which is really one of the forefront books at the research on the Doctrine of Discovery. And it's called Pagans in the Promised Land. And if you haven't heard of this book, you haven't read this book, I highly encourage you to look this book up and to read it. Steve makes some very compelling arguments about the deep injustice of both the founding of this nation as well as of some of the history of the church and what that's done to indigenous peoples here in the U.S. and in the Americas as well as throughout the world. So I highly respect Steve's work and I highly recommend his work. And there are many other great authors out there, especially other Native authors who have done a lot of work to bring this to the forefront. I want to take about 4 or 5, maybe 5 or 7 minutes to go through a bit of review of what I did in the class yesterday, which is basically to give kind of the history of the church. So when Jesus came into this world, he was coming against an expectation of Israel that they were looking for a political Messiah. And he worked very hard to change those expectations. So He was born in a stable. He was raised as a refugee. Yes, angels announced his presence and his coming, but they were singing to a bunch of shepherds. And so he really came to kind of show that he wasn't coming in this powerful political sense that people were expecting. And throughout much of his ministry, he was given opportunity to establish Christian empire. Satan tempted him with the kingdoms of the world, and Jesus walked away. The people came at one point to make him king by force, and he walked away. And he was very adamant throughout his ministry that he did not come here to establish an earthly kingdom. His kingdom was from somewhere else, he told Pilate. Even John the Baptist questioned his kind of anti-imperial methods when he was raising widows' sons from the dead and healing centurion servants. And Jesus, as I said in chapel today, was like, well, this is what I'm doing. Either get on board or get out of the way. And so Jesus was very clear. He did not come to establish a Christian empire. He came to plant a church. He came to make disciples. And he came to offer himself as a living sacrifice. And it wasn't really until Pentecost that the disciples got that. And they began moving forward, and most of the disciples died a martyr's death. In the spirit of what Jesus did, they died persecuted, they died a martyr's death. And so going into the first century, you had this early church that you joined, because it wasn't a formal institution. You joined this church through your baptism, through your discipleship, through your community, and through those around you. And when you joined this church, you were very clear that you were standing in opposition to empire. When you joined this church, you knew there was a good chance you would be persecuted, maybe even killed, because of your membership in this church. Now, in the 4th century, Constantine creates Christian empire. And he Christianizes Rome. And this heresy of Christian empire changes the foundations of what it means to be the church. Now, most of us actually blame Christian empire on Constantine, but I actually have done some research, and I would actually blame the heresy of Christian empire on Eusebius. Eusebius is the bishop of Caesarea, and he was writing an ecclesiastical history, a history of the church, from basically the life of Jesus up till the Council of Nicaea. Now, if you're writing a history of the church, ecclesiastical history, your book doesn't have a conclusion, correct? It doesn't end. Because when will the history of the church end? When Christ returns. So if you understand your place in history and the role of the church, your book is merely a chapter in this legacy of a story being written that's ongoing until Jesus comes again. And in his book, Eusebius works hard to establish the divinity of Christ and goes in sometimes gory, gruesome detail into the death of the martyrs. And he states that they were dying for the joy before them because they were sharing in the suffering of Christ. And then between books 8 and 9, he inserts a book. This is a volume of 11 books, the entire ecclesiastical history. And between books 8 and 9, he inserts a book called the Book of the Martyrs. 13 chapters of martyrs from both Palestine and Caesarea, many of which he says he witnessed personally their deaths, and many of them because they came from where he was from. He knew these people. And in books 8 and 9, his attitude towards martyrdom begins to change. And now, instead of being this thing that the Christians are embracing with joy, now it's something that's an injustice that might need to be stopped. And he begins to lift up the emperors of Rome. And he introduces both Constantinius, who is Constantine's father, and Constantine as kind of these divinely appointed emperors. And he actually compares Constantine to Moses and his battle at Milvain Bridge to Moses defeating Pharaoh at the Red Sea. And in his final chapter of book 10, again, writing ecclesiastical history, this history of a church that this book should not have an ending, he absolutely has a conclusion, and his conclusion is the salvation that comes to Rome, again, not through Christ, but through Constantine. He says, at the same time they celebrated and extolled, first of all, God, the universal king, because thus they were taught, but then they celebrated the praises, again, not of Christ, but of the pious emperor, and with him all his divinely favored children. There was a perfect oblivion of past evils, and past wickedness was buried in forgetfulness. There was nothing but enjoyment of the present blessing and expectations of those yet to come. The supreme God granted from heaven above the fruits of his piety, the trophies of victory over the wicked, and that Narcissus tyrant with his counselors and adherents, which he cast prostrate, again, not at the feet of Christ, but of Constantine. Because if you're going to create a Christian empire, which Jesus was absolutely opposed to, you have to first write Christ out of ecclesiastical history. Which is what Eusebius does. And replaces the Messiah figure with Constantine. So this fundamentally changes the church. And so, in the 5th century, we have Augustine, who is one of the theologians of the day, and they have to now wrestle with this heresy. And what do? Do we rebuke it and prophesy against it, or do we collude with it? Well, Augustine writes what's called a just war theory, and the just war theory has really two purposes. The first purpose is to help these Christian nations fight wars more justly, and the second is to justify why Christian citizens of these Christian nations, who are following this guy who told them to love their enemies and turn the other cheek and pray for those who persecute them, now how can they go out and kill in the name of God and country? Well, this is what the answer, this is the question the just war theory is trying to answer. So I use the fact that we have a just war theory as evidence that the theologians of the day were colluding with this heresy instead of prophesying against it. But I wanted to find the line, right? Because whenever you cross the line with Jesus, he rebukes you. When Peter says you don't have to die, Jesus calls him Satan. When James and John ask if they can call down fire from heaven, Jesus rebukes them. So I'm like, where's the line where when Augustine crosses it, Jesus is like, no, you're too far, and he would rebuke him. And I looked through the readings on just war, I looked through the writings on the two kingdoms, and I couldn't find the line where he was crossing it, where I could say, this is out of bounds. And then I was looking through his writings on the Donatists. The Donatists were a heretical group. They were kind of a thorn in Augustine's side. What do we do with these heretics who are leading people astray? And in chapter 5 of his book on the correction of the Donatists, Augustine is asking a question which is very prevalent or relevant to them in that day, which is, what do we do? What's the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire? I mean, we've never had this before. We've always been the oppressed. Now we have someone in power, so what's the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire? And he writes that his role is to prevent and chastise with religious severity all those acts which are done in opposition to the commands of the Lord. He serves him by enforcing with suitable rigor such laws as ordain what is righteous and punishes what is the reverse. In chapter 6, he goes on and says that it's better that people are driven to worship God through sound teaching, but we found advantage that in first being compelled by fear and pain, so that afterwards they might respond to teaching. So he's arguing the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to use the resources of the state to compel people to worship God through fear, punishment, and pain. I'm quite certain Jesus had no problem calling St. Peter Satan. He would have no problem calling St. Augustine Satan and saying, what are you thinking? You're not on the side of God, but of men. Now this, of course, this collusion leads into what we call the Crusades, which is about expanding the Christian empire as well as protecting Jerusalem. And then in the later centuries, in the 13th century, we have Aquinas who was writing. He's also wrestling with the role of the heretics. And he writes that if the secular state has the authority to kill people who break men's laws, how much more authority does the church have to kill people who break God's laws? He writes, it's a much graver matter to corrupt the faith which quickens the soul than to forge money which supports temporal life. Wherefore, forgers of money and other evildoers are forthwith condemned to death by the secular authority. How much more reason is there for heretics, as soon as they are convicted of heresy, to not only be excommunicated, but even put to death? So he's arguing the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to kill people who don't obey the commands of the church. This is completely outside of the bounds of the teachings of Jesus. Now, in the 13th century, the writers of the Christian church also introduced this new term called the infidel. The infidel is a category of other. It's a subhuman category. It's applied to the Moors, later to the Muslims. Or the Moors were the Muslims, later to indigenous peoples. Anyone who wasn't inside this bounds of the white European Christian male. So now that we have this subcategory of the infidel, now we don't even need a just war theory anymore. Now we can go to war based on our theological grounds. We're fighting the other. We're fighting the enemies of Christ. So it's out of this that in 1452, Pope Nicholas V writes out these words, which says, "Invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and to their use and profit." This papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, collectively become known as what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. This Doctrine of Discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever land you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They didn't believe them to be human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claim to have discovered it. Think about it. You can't discover lands already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your car keys, your cell phones, your laptops out. I'll come by and discover them for you. This isn't discovery, right? This is stealing. The fact that we have holidays and monuments and historical markers honoring Columbus as the discoverer of America, this reveals the implicit racial bias of the nation, which is that indigenous peoples, people of color, are not fully human. So this makes the Doctrine of Discovery a white, male, Christian supremacist doctrine that is the direct fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to the empire. Now the challenge is what we've done with this doctrine. So, in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he says to the colonists that they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upsets the colonies. They want access to those lands. So a few years later, they write a letter of protest. In their letter, they accuse the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They go on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the Founding Fathers used this inclusive term, all men, because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. So this makes the Declaration of Independence a systemically white supremacist document that assumes the dehumanization of indigenous peoples and people of color. Now, a few years later, our Founding Fathers wrote another document. They started this one with the words, "We the people of the United States," in order to form a more perfect union. This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. But if you keep reading, just a few lines later, down to Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 2 is the section of the Constitution that defines who is and who is not included in this union, who is and who is not covered by this Constitution. The first thing you have to know is it never mentions women. Now, this is important because if you read the entire Constitution, preamble through the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his, who can run for office, who can hold office, even who is protected by this document. And there is not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. So we first have to know Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? White landowning men. That's who could vote. See, we don't think about this. The reason we have a Constitution, the purpose it was written, is to protect the interests of white landowning men. So we act surprised today that women earn 70 cents to the dollar. Well, this shouldn't surprise us. The Constitution's working. We act surprised that our prisons are filled with people of color. This shouldn't surprise us. The Constitution's working. People get outraged that in 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This is what opens the door for super PACs, unlimited contributions to candidates. This shouldn't surprise us. The Constitution is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is protecting the interests of white landowning men. Now maybe you're thinking, wait, we corrected those things, right? Well, we tried. So about 100 years later, we passed the 13th Amendment. Who can tell me what the 13th Amendment does? Abolish slavery. That's what we think it does. We think it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. What it actually says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, where the parties been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So have we ever abolished slavery? No. Where is it legal? Prison. So let's look at our incarceration rates. Well, it should surprise no one that we incarcerate our citizens at the highest rate of any country in the world. For every 100,000 citizens, we incarcerate 693 of them. That's 10 higher, or it's 100 higher than the next nation, which is Turkmenistan, and about 3 to 5 times higher than most every other nation. This is just comparing us to the NATO nations. And when we break the numbers out by race, it's even worse. We incarcerate Hispanics at a rate of 831, American Indians at a rate of 895, and Black Americans at a rate of 2,306 per 100,000. White people, of course, are incarcerated at a much more palatable rate of 450. So we just have to be clear. We've never abolished slavery. It's legal in the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. And to this day, we use it to maintain and remove the civil rights from our people of color. Now, a few years later, we passed another amendment. This was a direct response to Article 1, Section 2. This is the 14th Amendment. If you read the 14th Amendment, it actually extends the rights of citizenship to anyone born on this continent under the jurisdiction of the government. Not a bad amendment. But if you keep reading to Section 2, it specifically excludes natives. It specifically excludes women. And it makes the full rights of citizenship dependent, again, upon the criminal justice system. So while this amendment extends some rights of citizenship to a few former male slaves, it still leaves disenfranchised and marginalized huge sections of the population. And we forget that even after this amendment, we still have Jim Crow laws, we still have Indian massacres, we still have women not having full rights to vote, we still have boarding schools, we still have internment camps, and in 1970, this is the very same amendment that gets referenced in Roe versus Wade, which now concludes babies aren't fully human and therefore they can be aborted. So what this demonstrates is at the heart of our Constitution, we don't have a value for life. The value is actually for exploitation and profit, and the assumption is one of dehumanization. So this makes our Constitution a systemically white supremacist and sexist document that assumes the white landowning male has the authority to decide who is and who is not human. Now, a few years later, 1820s, we had a Supreme Court case. Johnson versus McIntosh. It's two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them took the land from a native tribe, bought the land from a native tribe. The other one got the land from the government, and they wanted to know who owned it. Who had the right to sell the land, the tribe or the government? The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The court has to decide the precedent, the legal precedent for land titles. They rule that the principle is that discovery gives title to the government, by whose subject and by whose authority it was made against all other European governments. And that title is consummated by possession. They then go on to reference this doctrine of discovery as a legal instrument and use this to conclude that natives who are here first, but are savages and therefore less than human, we only have what's called the right of occupancy to land. Like a fish would occupy water, a bird would occupy air. And Europeans have the fee title to the land, the right of discovery to the land, and therefore they are the true title holders. This case, along with a few others in the 1820s and 30s, create the legal precedent for land titles. Now, this precedent and the doctrine of discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. Demonstrating that to this day, the United States Supreme Court is a systemically white supremacist court that has legal precedent based on the dehumanization of indigenous peoples and people of color. Now in 1630, initially the Protestant church pushed back against the doctrine of discovery. This was a Catholic doctrine. They didn't fully buy into it. 1630, John Winthrop is in what's now called the Boston Harbor. He's with a group of people here to plant the Boston colony, and he preaches a sermon called A Model of Christian Charity. In his sermon, he refers to the columnist that he's with as a city on a hill. He's borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining as your deeds into this dark world. He goes on to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. You should rejoice together. You should mourn together. You should labor and suffer together. You should keep the unity of the spirits in the bond of peace. These are just your basic Protestant Christian exhortation. And of his sermon, he exhorts them to obey his teaching by quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 30 is the passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing at the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised lands. And God's reiterating the threats and promises of his land covenant. If you obey me, I'll do these things for you. If you disobey me, I'll do these things to you. And in this passage it says, but if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in quoting this passage, John Winthrop changes that word river to vast sea. Now, why would he do this? Well, they didn't cross a river, they crossed an ocean. So what's he implying? Based on Jesus' exhortation to be a city on a hill, based on the land covenant with the God of Israel, they are at the shores of their promised land, ready to take possession of it. Now, who here's read the book of Joshua and Deuteronomy? What's God's command? How are they to take possession of their promised land? What are they to do to the Canaanites? Kill everybody, right? Leave no man, no woman, no child, no animal left alive. Promised land for one group of people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. I refer to this sermon as the birth of American exceptionalism. This idea percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, we go past the Appalachian Mountains, past the Mississippi River. We begin moving further and further west. End of the 1800s, or of the 1700s, the Second Great Awakening occurs. There's a growth in churches. There's a renewal of denominations. There's this religious fervor as we're going further and further west. Early 1800s, the term manifest destiny is coined. This belief that this white supremacist Christian empire has the God-given right to rule this continent from sea to shining sea. So now that we have a white supremacist doctrine of discovery, a white supremacist Declaration of Independence, a white supremacist and sexist constitution, a white supremacist Supreme Court, and God's permission to commit genocide, now we have some history we don't know how to talk about. So let's think about the 19th century. I made this graph a few years ago. This is our nation from 1776 to 2016. Every year in blue is the year I found that we were in a declared state of war or some formal armed military conflict against another nation or entity. Every year in red is the year I found us fighting against native tribes. If you look at the 19th century, we have almost 75 straight years of armed conflict against native tribes. These are the wars we fought primarily during the 19th century. This is the century our history books refer to as our century of expansion. We added almost 30 new states to the Union during the 19th century. But clearly this isn't expansion, this is ethnic cleansing and genocide. As we're completing our manifest destiny. It's during this century that we have the Indian Removal Act. This is the act of Congress that gives the U.S. military, in practice, the right by force to remove tribes from their lands in the east to empty lands further in the west. This is what results in the Trail of Tears for the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Long Walk for the Navajo and some of the Apache. All told, about a dozen tribes or more experienced forced relocation, and tens of thousands of people die as a direct result of this act. In 1862, we have the largest mass execution in the history of the nation, with the hanging of the Dakota 38, ordered by Abraham Lincoln. 1864, we have the massacre at Sand Creek. We'll talk about this a bit more, about 150, 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children massacred in a single day. 1879, we have the start of Indian boarding schools, policy of the U.S. government to kill the Indian to save the man. Native children are taken from their homes, they're put into military-style boarding schools, they're punished for speaking their languages, they're punished for practicing their culture. The stories of abuse, emotional, physical, mental, sexual, that happen in these boarding schools are gut-wrenching. And the last of these schools don't close until the 1970s and 80s. In 1890, we have one of the more famous massacres. It's the massacre at Wounded Knee. About 300 to 350 Dakota men, women, and children are slaughtered in a single day. We teach this a bit more in our history books, but we don't go into the full story. What was happening at Wounded Knee is that the U.S. government was trying to negotiate the surrender of one of the Dakota chiefs. So they met at Wounded Knee, and they were negotiating this, and neither side trusted each other. There was a lot of weapons around. And no one quite knows what happened, but someone fired a gun. They don't know who fired it, but a gun got fired, and chaos ensued. Now the Army, the U.S. Army, had up to 4 what are called Hotchkiss cannons at Wounded Knee. These are 60 millimeter cannons. They shoot up to 68, 70 rounds a minute. They're accurate up to 2,000 yards. They have up to 4 of them there. And in the chaos, many of the Dakota people run into a ravine that is located right there at Wounded Knee to seek shelter from these guns. Now, what we don't teach about Wounded Knee is that the U.S. Army awards 18 Medals of Honor to soldiers from the U.S. who participated in this massacre. And 3 of them, the one for William Austin, the one for John Gresham, and the one for Albert McMillan, were awarded specifically for flushing the Dakota people out of the ravine. In 1840, this is what our country looked like. The dark states on the east are the actual states. The lighter lands to the west are territories or yet even uncharted lands. If you go onto the U.S. government military's website, you can look up Medals of Honor by conflict and by war. And if you look up Medals of Honor for the Indian war campaigns, you will find that we award 500 Medals of Honor to U.S. soldiers who participated in the Indian Wars. And in the 1900s, this is what the nation looked like. During this year, this century, the majority population ballooned from 5.3 million to 76.2 million, and the native population plummeted from 600,000 to 237,000. If you're keeping track, that's a 61.47% rate of genocide. If you're comparing that, it's almost twice as high as the rate of genocide Nazi Germany had during the Holocaust. So we just have to be honest. Between 1839 and 1898, the U.S. Army awards 425 medals of honor for the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Native peoples from this continent. December 19, 2009, Congress passes and President Obama signs House Resolution 3326. This is the 2010 Department of Defense Appropriations Act. It's a 67-page document laying out the appropriations for the DoD for 2010. Page 45, subsection 8113 is titled Apology to Native Peoples of the United States. What follows is this 7-bullet point apology. Mentions no specific tribe, no specific treaty, no specific injustice. Basically said you Native tribes had some nice land. Our citizens didn't take it very politely. Let's now just call it all of our land and steward it together. Then it ends with a disclaimer saying nothing in here is legally binding. To date, this apology has not been announced, read, or publicized by the White House or by Congress. See, the problem is we don't teach a history of America, we teach a mythology. The mythology is that we have a legacy of discovery, we believe in equality, we have a history of expansion, we're exceptional, liberty and justice here exist for everybody, and we're a Christian nation. Let me show you how deep this mythology runs. Who here has ever been to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C.? Okay, keep your hands up. Who here has been to the museum at the base of the memorial? Okay, the base of the memorial, go ahead and put your hands down. There's a small museum, about maybe 2/3 the size of this room. On each wall, there are different plaques that have writings and quotes of different parts of Abraham Lincoln's legacy. On one wall is a series of 5 or 6 plaques with his writings about the Union. The center of that wall, etched in stone, the size of this window, is a plaque that says, "I would save the Union. My paramount object in this struggle," wrote Abraham Lincoln, "is to save the Union. It's not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. If I could save by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." There's a plaque hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally states, according to Abraham Lincoln, black lives don't matter. I don't know what's more offensive, the fact that he said it or someone felt it appropriate to hang there. Again, we don't teach a history of a country, we teach a mythology. The mythology says discovery, the history says dehumanization. The mythology says equality, the history says for a select few. The mythology says expansion, the history says ethnic cleansing. The mythology says exceptionalism, the history says genocide. The mythology says liberty and justice for all, the history says liberty and justice for white landowning men. The mythology says Christian nation, the history says we are the next version of Christian empire, of Christendom. Now again, you're thinking that's a bit strong, Mr. Charles. Well, let's think back just a year and a half ago. There was a terrorist attack in Europe. Several people died. And on the day of that attack, Clay Higgins, who's the congressman from Louisiana, he represents the 3rd District of Louisiana. On his website, it says that he is a Christian who is known for his refreshing focus on the power of the individual to be redeemed. On the day of this terrorist attack, this is what he posted to his public Facebook page. "The free world, all of Christendom, is at war with Islamic horror. Not one penny of American treasure should be granted to any nation who harbors these heathen animals. Not a single radicalized Islamic suspect should be granted any measure of quarter. Their intended entry to the American homeland should be summarily denied. Every conceivable measure should be engaged to hunt them down, hunt them, identify them, and kill them all for the sake of all that's good and righteous, kill them all." Clay Higgins, U.S. Congressman from Louisiana, June 4th, 2017. And Facebook didn't even take this down as hate speech. I want to pause here for a moment and just take a moment to kind of exhale. Now, there's no right or wrong answer. There's no good or no bad answer. I merely want you to emote for me just for a few moments. And I don't want a long story. I want 2 or 3 words. Tell me, how does this history make you feel? There's no right or wrong answer, no good or bad answer. Just 2 or 3 words. How does this history make you feel?
Guilty, fearful.
Guilty and fearful.
Very sad.
Very sad.
Deceived.
Deceived.
Repulsed.
Repulsed.
Weary.
Weary.
Devastated.
Devastated.
Angry.
Ashamed and angry.
Sick.
Sick. Yeah. It's important that we acknowledge these emotions because there's a reason we don't talk about these things. Right? We don't know what to do with them. We don't know what to do with this image of our nation as a genocidal, ethnic cleansing nation. It is contrary to every other narrative we've been hearing since birth. And we don't know what to do with it. Now, unfortunately, it's going to get a bit worse for a moment. It will get better, but first it's going to get a bit worse. So if I were to ask you, what is the single most deadliest day in human history caused by man? Not global warming, not a volcano, not a natural disaster. The single deadliest day caused by man. Any guesses? Hiroshima. Okay. Any other guesses?
D-Day.
D-Day? Okay. Technically, it's Operation Meeting House. Operation Meeting House is the firebombing of Tokyo. We dropped thousands of bombs upon Tokyo. We burned the city overnight. Our estimates are we killed 100,000 people. The Japanese estimates are higher. It's actually hard to count because we chose Tokyo because it was a wooden city. We knew it would burn hotter. And you actually couldn't even tell from what was left over the number of people who died. Now, why don't we know this? Why don't we teach it? Who won World War II? We did, right? Who writes the history books? The winners. Do you think the Japanese know this history? Yeah. One of the challenges we face as America is we've actually never lost a war that matters. We've never been lost a war where we were invaded and we lost land. We won World War I, won World War II. We pulled out of Vietnam. Technically, the Korean War hasn't ended yet. That might change today or tomorrow. But we've never lost a war that mattered. As a result, we've written our own history for almost 250 years. And when you write your own history, you get to create the mythology. Now, let's pretend for a moment that Germany wins World War II, okay? How would their history books treat Hitler? He's a hero. How would their history books treat the Holocaust? Wouldn't talk about it. What Holocaust, right? Okay. So who would you say is America's greatest president? Not, again, I'm not asking your favorite president, but who is a general national consensus? Who is America's greatest president?
FDR.
FDR? Any other guesses? Well, if you vote by traffic to their memorials and by national polls, in the last 30 to 40 years, almost by national consensus, Abraham Lincoln would be considered America's greatest president. Why? Well, he's the great emancipator, he's the great unifier, he won the Civil War, and he abolished slavery. He's especially as race relations has gotten worse in this nation, Abraham Lincoln has been seen and looked to more and more as our greatest president. Now, the problem is because we haven't lost the war in 250 years, we actually don't know squat about Abraham Lincoln, even here in Illinois. So let me go through some research on Abraham Lincoln. So in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln was a fairly new political candidate, and he was trying to establish a name and a platform for himself in the debates with Stephen Douglas. Now, the debates back then were not like the debates we have now, where you have a 1-minute response and a 2-minute rebuttal and blah, blah, blah. They had a series of 3 speeches. The first speech lasted like 45 minutes, the second speech was about an hour, and then the first candidate would come back and give a response for about another half hour to 40 minutes. So they had a series of 3 speeches. And in one of the first debates with Judge Stephen Douglas, Abraham Lincoln was trying to establish himself, and he had a challenge he was facing, which is it was known that he was against the institution of chattel slavery. And he was trying to make sure people were clear on where he stood. And so in one of his first speeches, he said, "I will say here while upon this subject that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races. There's a physical difference between the two, which in my judgment will probably forever forbid their living together on the footing of perfect equality. And inasmuch as it becomes a necessity that there must be a difference, I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong having the superior position." Abraham Lincoln's a clear white supremacist. A month later, he reiterates himself almost verbatim, "I will say then that I am not and never have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social or political equality of white and black races," to applause. "That I am not and never have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. I will say in addition to this that there is a difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two living together on terms of social and political equality, and inasmuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." In his inaugural address, he felt it was necessary to restate himself, and so he said, "Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the ascension of a Republican administration, their property, i.e. their slaves, and their peace and personal security is being endangered. I declare that," and now he's just quoting himself directly from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now, the morning of the inauguration, the country was actually in a tizzy. Senate was in a tizzy, because states were threatening to secede from the nation. And so the morning, like 5 a.m. on the morning of the inauguration, the Senate passes what's called the Corwin Amendment. Now, the Corwin Amendment constitutionally protects slavery in states where it already exists. It says that no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of the said state. And in his inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln felt the need to address this amendment, and he said, "I understand a proposed amendment to the Constitution that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institutions of the states, including that of persons held to service. To avoid misconstruction of what I've said, I depart from my purpose not to speak of particular amendments, so far as to say that holding such a provision to now by implied constitutional law, I have no objection to it being made express and irrevocable." So he supports this amendment, constitutionally protecting slavery in the states where it already exists. In 1862, he signs the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act allots 160 acres to any family willing to go west and homestead for 5 years. And later, in July of 1862, he signs the Pacific Railway Act. The Pacific Railway Act provides the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway, which has so far made it up to Omaha, Nebraska. This will get it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This is completing our manifest destiny. In the fall of 62, Horace Greeley wrote a pretty scathing op-ed to Abraham Lincoln calling for the immediate emancipation of the slaves. Now, Abraham Lincoln already had the Emancipation Proclamation written. It was in his desk. But he was afraid because there were 4 states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, that were northern states that had not seceded from the Union, but they allowed slavery. And so he wanted to assure the slave owners in these states where he stood with them. And so he didn't want to release the Emancipation Proclamation. And so he wrote in his letter, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It's not to save or destroy slavery." So he wanted to assure the slave owners that he didn't believe Black Lives Mattered. He was doing what he was doing for the good of the Union. Now, in the fall of 62, the Dakota people, who had previously signed the treaty with the U.S. government, and their treaty, which would give them provisions for their survival in exchange for some land, the U.S. government was not meeting the treaty obligations. And they almost died the winter before. They almost got wiped out. It was a very brutal winter. And so they make this very reluctant decision in the fall of 62 to go to war against the settlers and the U.S. government because they were going into another winter and they didn't want to be exterminated. And so it starts a very bloody war that lasts a little over a month. Many people die on both sides, and at the end of the war, half of the Dakota warriors flee north to Canada, the other half surrender and turn themselves in. They're immediately put into military tribunals. They're now being judged by the very people they were just fighting. These cases share witnesses. They're conducted in foreign languages. The Dakota people don't really know what's going on. These are quite clearly just legal shams. The end of these trials, over 400 of them are condemned to death. No general wants to sign off on that many, so they send it up to Lincoln. And he is concerned that that number is a bit too high for that many executions. So he doesn't order retrials. He just changes the criteria of what warrants a death sentence. Under his new criteria, only 2 of the warriors are going to die. And now he's concerned because his white settlers are beginning to revolt. So again, he doesn't order retrials. He just changes the criteria a second time. And he lands on the magic number of 38. So the day after Christmas, 1862, thousands of white settlers come out in Minnesota. They're singing hymns of praise while the largest mass execution in the history of the nation takes place with the hanging of the Dakota 38. January of 63, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Now, if you read the Emancipation Proclamation, it's very specific as to where it frees the slaves. They're freed in Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. What's missing from this list? Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. The northern states that allowed slavery. For those states and other exempted parts, they are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And the slaves in those states didn't get their freedom until after Lincoln dies. In February of 63, in response to the Dakota War, Abraham Lincoln signs a bill giving him the right to, basically terminates the treaties with the Dakota people and the Winnebago in Minnesota. In March of 63, he signs another bill which gives him the right to remove the tribes from the state without treaty or negotiation. That removal begins in April. They're loaded up onto barges, they're loaded up onto wagons, they're loaded up onto boats and trains, and they're shipped out of Minnesota into Dakota Territory, into the Crow Creek Reservation that's not suitable to sustain life for all of them. It's a very inhumane process of removing them out of the state, and that removal is concluded by late summer, early fall of 63. In the fall of '63, one of Abraham Lincoln's generals, General Carleton, who's fighting the Navajo, my people, in the territory of New Mexico, he gives this order. He says, henceforth, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the Bosque Redondo, or we will pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or move. There can be no other talk on this subject. So, Kit Carson, a U.S. captain, Army captain, goes through the territory of our Navajo people. He burns our hogans, he kills our livestock, he destroys our crops, and he begins basically chasing our family units throughout our reservation, or not our reservation, throughout our lands. Historian Raymond Friday Locke records in his book, The Book of the Navajo, that by the middle of December, most of the weak and the aged had died. There's hardly a Navajo family that cannot remember tales of an aged grandfather, a pregnant mother, or a lame child that had to be left behind when the camp had to be quickly deserted. The patrols were not interested in taking captives. It was too much trouble to transport them back to the forts. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. Mothers were sometimes forced to suffocate their hungry, crying babies to keep their families from being discovered and butchered by an army patrol or taken captive by the slave raiders. In January of '64, Abraham Lincoln signs a bill creating what they called the Reservation of Bosque Redondo, which is where they were moving the Navajo people to. But this wasn't a reservation, this was a death camp. Over the next few months and years, nearly 10,000 Navajo men, women, and children were forcibly marched down to Bosque Redondo. Hundreds of our people died of exposure and starvation along the way. When they got to the reservation, to this death camp, there was alkali in the soil, there was no greenery, there was nothing to build huts with, there was nowhere to live. In one of the books, they actually said that we lived like prairie dogs in burrows. We were fed the slops that were too rancid for the soldiers to eat. And almost a quarter of our people died while imprisoned at this death camp. In his annual message to Congress in 1863, Abraham Lincoln proudly reports that 1.4 million acres were taken up under the Homestead Law. And in July of '64, he signs the second half of the Pacific Railway Act. This doubles the amount of land given to the completion of the Transcontinental Railway and allows that to be completed, provides the resources for that to be completed. In the fall of '64, so if you go back to the 1850s, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were signed a treaty with the United States government that basically allotted eastern Colorado, western Nebraska, and southern Wyoming as their treaty land. And then in the mid to late 1850s, gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains. Over the next few years, thousands of white settlers and prospectors moved into the land, encroaching on the land of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Just a few weeks before Lincoln was inaugurated, the U.S. government negotiated another treaty, reducing their land holdings down to 1/13 the size of what they were before. That fall of '64, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were on their treaty land. They were waving a white flag of surrender and an American flag to show they were there peacefully. A U.S. Army led by a Methodist pastor comes in, and he orders all of them slaughtered. The men were actually out hunting and doing other stuff that day, and so it was primarily women and elderly and children at this camp. It's later reported that the soldiers paraded the genitalia of the natives down the streets of Denver. Within a year, 2 years of this massacre, the Cheyenne and Arapaho completely surrender, and they're removed from Colorado to the state of Oklahoma. In his annual message to Congress in 1864, Abraham Lincoln reports that 1.5 million acres were entered under the Homestead Law, and that the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railways and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. Now, if you look at the plans for the Transcontinental Railway, There was a primary line that went from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento and San Francisco in Northern California. There was another line that was planned to go from Duluth, Minnesota, through Minnesota, North Dakota, Idaho, Montana, and Washington and come out near Seattle. And there was a southern route that was supposed to go through the territory of New Mexico and come out near San Diego or Los Angeles. Within 2.5 years of signing the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, Abraham Lincoln has ethnically cleansed most of the tribes from the state of Minnesota, the state of Colorado, and the territory of New Mexico. Now, his final chapter of his legacy is the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. Now, to understand the 13th Amendment, you have to understand the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, again, Abraham Lincoln and Judge Douglas are both blatant white supremacists. He states so over and over and over again. They both get cheers from the audience by affirming white supremacy. They both get laughs from the audience by cautiously suggesting that black people might somehow be equal. They disagree on slavery. Judge Douglas is convinced we need slavery to keep white supremacy intact. Abraham Lincoln is of the thought that we can keep white supremacy even without the institution of slavery. So Judge Douglas wants to draw a distinction, and so he accuses Lincoln of applying the Declaration of Independence to people of color. And Abraham Lincoln responds in the debates and says, I think the authors of that noble document intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all men are equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. Now, he's not talking about individuals, he's talking about race. Okay? Later, Judge Douglas accuses him of wanting to make citizens of black people. In this very debate, Abraham Lincoln already has stated he has no intention of making voters or jurors of black people or allowing them to intermarry. But he responds and says, well, you've never asked me this question before, but you'll never have to ask it again, because I'll tell you very frankly, I am not in favor of Negro citizenship. He says, it's my opinion the different states have the power to make a Negro citizen under the Constitution, but if the state of Illinois had that power, I would be opposed to the exercise of it. So President Lincoln has a problem, which is he wants to end slavery, but he doesn't believe Black Lives Matter. He doesn't want to make citizens of black people, and he doesn't think the Declaration of Independence applies to him. So what do? This is his dilemma. What do you do when you want to free them from chattel slavery, but you don't think they're equal, you don't want them to intermarry, you don't want them to become voters or jurors or judges? What do you do with these people of color? Well, you put a clause in the amendment that allows a white law enforcement officer, a white judge, or a white jury to remove the civil rights of a black person on a whim. That's what you do. If you've seen the documentary 13 does a great job of connecting the 13th Amendment to mass incarceration. We just don't connect Lincoln to the 13th Amendment. So why is he our greatest president? Well, he's not the great emancipator. He unified white people. The Civil War isn't the war he won. The actual war he won is the war of manifest destiny. The Civil War to him was just an internal spat. In the debates, he said, what is it that we hold most dear amongst us? It's our own liberty and prosperity. What has threatened our liberty and prosperity, save and accept this institution of slavery? Now, he's not concerned about the slaves primarily revolting. He's not worried about another country coming in and freeing the slaves. He's saying, we're going to kill ourselves, white people, because we can't decide what to do with slavery. We have this great white supremacist, ethnic cleansing, manifest destiny thing going on here. And we're going to destroy ourselves because we can't figure out to deal with these subhuman people of color. That's what he was most concerned about. That's what he was most threatened by. That was what he was most afraid of. He didn't abolish slavery. He protected white supremacy. He gave us the tools we're using today. Right? This thing that happened in the Starbucks, Philadelphia. This is his design, right? Guy goes in, wants to use the bathroom. The white shop owner doesn't want them there, calls the cops. You get arrested. That's how the system's supposed to work. That's how Abraham Lincoln wanted it. In 1860 is the first census we had where we counted Native peoples. These are not the savage Indians living in the territories. These are the off-reservation, assimilated, tax-paying Indians who were living in our urban centers. In 1860, we had 44,000 of them. In 1870, we had 25,000. Most of the people who were reduced came from the states of California and from the state of New Mexico. Again, this is where the Long Walk took place in California. We'll cover this, and it had a huge ethnic cleansing policy going on in the 1860s as well. So 41% rate of genocide during the decade that Abraham Lincoln was president. And this is just not among the savage natives, this is among the assimilated, off-reservation, tax-paying natives. So the comparison between Lincoln and Hitler is easy. Their numbers speak for themselves. That's not a hard stretch. This is what's more nauseating. In the 1500, the world population was 480 million. In 1900, it was 1.6 million, or billion. In Europe, they grew from 82 million to 300 million. Africa, even though massive numbers of slaves were being exported, they went from 63 million to 123 million. The U.S. went essentially from 0 non-native people to 76 million. And in that period, and this is a very conservative estimate, the number of native peoples living in the continental United States was about 6 million, and we had been reduced to 237,000, which is a 96.05% rate of genocide. You compare that to the other great genocides. The Rwanda Tutsi genocide had a 68.04%. Hitler had a 35.29%. Manifest Destiny, the 19th century, had a 60%. And the discovery of Turtle Island had 96.05%. So it's truly nauseating. It's not only is Abraham Lincoln so easily comparable to Adolf Hitler, it's that the United States of America is essentially Nazi Germany. We just won our wars. It's the only difference. We won our wars. So we celebrate the people who committed genocide and ethnic cleansing on our behalf. Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of the state of California, in his first Day of the State address, this is what he said: that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying the fact that people are going to die because of disease. He's saying we can't stop ourselves from exterminating these people. I'm convinced that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I would call ours Truth and Conciliation, and my goal is 2021. This is what I'm working towards. Now, I want to talk a bit about these commissions. So, many times these are called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And in our context in the U.S., the primary issue that we would be reconciling around is race, correct? So who's heard of this term, racial reconciliation? We throw this term around a lot. It sounds beautiful, right? It sounds biblical. It sounds beautiful. It sounds like, yeah, there's this great thing going on. But this is a misnomer. This word is inaccurate. First of all, race is a human construct. There's no genetic definition of race. I don't care what DNA.com tells you. There's no genetic definition of race. It's a human construct. So the black race was constructed here in America in part through what's called the one-drop rule. Right? The one-drop rule states if you have a single drop of African blood, you're black. Now, why do we have this rule? Well, because blacks were the labor pool. Our nation wanted as many black people as possible. A one-drop rule let a white slave owner rape his female slaves and produce more baby slaves. For natives, the American Indians, we had what's called the blood quantum rule. This rule states you're full, you're half, you're a quarter, you're an eighth, you're a 16th, you're a 32nd, then you're bred out of existence. Why do we have this rule? Well, we had treaty obligations to native peoples. Our mythology says we discovered this land, it was empty. We want as few native peoples as possible. So the blood quantum rule lets us breed natives out of existence. So race is a human construct, and in America, race was constructed expressly for the purpose of oppressing and dividing and even exterminating. And reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. It's not the right, it's a beautiful word, but it's not the right word. It's wrong. It's incorrect. Racial reconciliation is not an accurate word. It's a misnomer. So we don't need racial reconciliation. We need racial conciliation. Conciliation is merely mediation of a dispute. Racial reconciliation perpetuates the myth. Racial conciliation gives us a much more honest starting point. So we don't need a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We need a National Truth and Conciliation Commission. Now, to engage this dialogue, there's 4 audiences I really want to engage with. The first, this is to prep our nation for this conversation. The first group I want to talk with is the church. The church wrote the Doctrine of Discovery. The church has been in bed with empire for 2,000 years. The church has been complicit in this history. It's been both an enabler and an initiator of this genocide and of this ethnic cleansing. And my message to the church, my invitation to the church, is to the practice of lament. My co-author on my book on Settling Truth, his name is Soong-Chan Rah. He recently published a book called Prophetic Lament. Wonderful book. I highly encourage you to get it and to read it. And he compares lament to like being at a funeral dirge. You have a dead body in the casket. It's not going to come back to life. The reason you go to the funeral is to lament, is to weep, is to mourn. The church literally has 2,000 years of dead bodies in caskets. And they're not going to come back to life. We can't fix it. The only thing we can do is weep. The only thing we can do is mourn. The only thing we can do is lament. Now, if you read the scriptures, when the people of God lament, he always shows up. He doesn't come quickly, but he does show up. The problem with the American church and Christian empire, this heretical institution, is that it cannot stay in lament long enough. Because it's written Christ out of ecclesiastical history, There's no blood there of Christ to cover the sin. And so the way that we move on is through our mythological belief in our own exceptionalism. And when you believe in your own exceptionalism, there's no space to lament. Because you can't acknowledge anything's broken. Everything has to be a progression forward. You can never look back. And so, as Soon-Chan points out in his book, the American church is anemic at the practice of lament. And so, I'm calling the church into a space of lament, because when you lament, God always shows up. The problem is the American church never stays in lament long enough to meet God there. We go there for maybe a song, perhaps a service, but throughout the scriptures, the people of God lament for days, weeks, months, some even years. And God doesn't come quickly, but he always shows up. And when he does something so transformational that it boggles people's minds. But we don't stay there long enough to meet God. As a result, there's this huge side of God's character we never interact with. So my invitation to the church is not into a service of lament or a period of lament. I'm saying let's go into a season of lament. Because who changes the seasons? God does. The second group I want to talk with are communities of color. Now, my message to people of color is about trauma. So who's heard of PTSD? Post-traumatic stress. This is a mental condition that happens to someone who experiences a horrifying event. It affects you mentally, physically, emotionally, relationally. It's kind of this all-encompassing position. But it's an individual diagnosis. This person who experienced this event is now suffering with post-traumatic stress or even a post-traumatic stress disorder. And so PTSD is an individual diagnosis for someone who's experienced a horrifying event. Now, there's another trauma called historical trauma, HTR. And historical trauma has been identified primarily by psychologists working in Native communities. And historical trauma is not an individual diagnosis. It actually comes out of an understanding of what's called complex PTSD. But it's even more than that. It's not just complex PTSD. It doesn't come from a single event. It comes from a long duration of horrifying experiences. Someone who lives in an abusive relationship, someone who's been a slave, someone who's had an extended period of trauma. But HTR, historical trauma, applies this at a communal level. So it's really trying to understand the dissatisfaction, not in an individual, but in an entire community that's experienced a complex version of post-traumatic stress. And so, if you want to go and work in communities of color, and while this was primarily developed to understand the dissatisfaction in Native communities, you can see it in African American and Jewish American and Japanese American, in a lot of other historically oppressed groups of people. You can see these symptoms of HTR, of historical trauma. So if you want to come and work on my reservation or go to another reservation or go to an inner city environment, you want to deal with the issue of race, and you're not aware of the historical trauma of our community and of the PTSD of our boarding school survivors and our incarcerated citizens and all these other traumas we have going on, you're going to come in and say something and you're going to trigger a response in our communities, and it's going to derail your entire work. Now, fortunately, there's been a lot of research into both of these, and so we're getting better at understanding the impact this has in our communities, and we're getting better at moving it forward. But there's another, but to be honest, I'm talking about people of color. What group of people is most likely to derail the conversation on race? It's white people, right? Now, there's another trauma out there that most of us have never heard of, and it's called PITS. Perpetration-induced traumatic stress. So the psychologist who's working on this primarily is Rachel McNair. And she identifies PITS as being like PTSD in every way, shape, and form. Except instead of afflicting people who experience a horrifying event, PITS, she argues, afflicts the perpetrator, the person who caused the horrifying event. Her book actually looks at what she calls the psychology of killing. And she looks at people who have a state-sanctioned kind of license to kill. And what does this do to them psychologically? People who fly drones, people who commit abortions, people who go off and have a right to kill in the name of the state. What does this do to them psychologically? In her research, she looks closely at this quote by Socrates, who says the doer of injustice is more miserable than the sufferer, and she looks at a very comprehensive study on Vietnam veterans. And this is how she comes to her diagnosis of PITS. So I argue that if PTSD has a multi-generational communal manifestation, which we would call historical trauma, which is what's afflicting our communities of color, it would make sense to me that PITS would also have a multi-generational communal manifestation, which is what I identify as the trauma that's afflicting white Americans. Now, I'm not trying to convince white people they're traumatized. I just treat them as traumatized. I'm trying to convince people of color that white people are traumatized. Why? Because in most racial dialogues, white people occupy one of two spots. They're either racist or they're fragile. Now, I don't find either of these incredibly helpful. So, if white people are racist, if just solely because you lack pigmentation in your skin, that means you're racist. It means anytime I get confronted by or disagreed on with by a white person, I have to treat that as a threat, and I have to defend myself, or even go on the attack. It also means white people have no place in the dialogue. That's not helpful. Now, the whole notion of white fragility, and I think D'Angelo, the woman who wrote did the work on white fragility, she has a lot of really good research and I think a lot of good observations about what goes into what she calls white fragility. But the challenge I have is I don't like the paradigm of fragility. If white people are fragile, it means I can only have one of two responses to them. If I'm helping you move, and you have a box that's marked as fragile, I have one of two choices. I can treat it with kitten gloves, or I can say, oh, I saw them pack this box, there's just a bunch of towels in there, and I throw it in the truck, not knowing you put your china at the bottom of the box, and I break your stuff. Those are my only two responses in this paradigm of fragility. And so anytime I say something that upsets a white person, if they're fragile, I have to now soothe it over. Or I have to intentionally break them aggressively, because I don't care. Neither of those are helpful. I love the paradigm of trauma because it allows me to go into this understanding of a counselor. So when one of the first symptoms of trauma is shock and denial. And so when you understand that when you're traumatized, usually it's your friends and your neighbors and your people around you who realize you're traumatized before you are. And so they send you into a counselor maybe. And if you go to a counselor, the first thing your counselor's trying to do is to understand what's called a trigger, right? Now a trigger is a sight, a sound, or a smell. It's something that takes you out of reality and puts you back into the environment of when the trauma occurs. And so if we understand, does that make sense, what a trigger is? It's a sight, a sound, a smell. It takes you out of reality, puts you back into the chaos of the moment of when the trauma occurs. And so when you're dealing with someone who's triggered, so if you're in your counselor's office and a butterfly flies by the window and your butterfly is what triggers you, and you start screaming at your counselor, right? Your counselor doesn't scream back at you, right? They're like, oh good, we found a trigger, right? Now, do they shut the window and say, I'll never show you the butterfly again? No, they're like, cool, we found a trigger. Let's talk about it. This is what makes counselors so annoying, right? They find your trigger, and they're like, let's talk about your trigger. So when we understand white Americans as another group of traumatized people, it's very easy to see their triggers, right? So 8 years of a black president was a trigger. Right? White America did not know what to do with the optic of a white man governing from an office they had constitutionally protected for white landowning men. They didn't know what to do with that. This is why we elected President Trump. He's a triggered reaction to a black president. Without 8 years of President Obama, Republicans would never elect someone as morally unethical, as unable to tell the truth, as racist and sexist as President Trump. They just wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. They were triggered by 8 years of a black president. Right? Any sort of national dialogue on immigration and gun control is a trigger. White America can't have this conversation without screaming at each other. I call ISIS a trigger. Why is ISIS a trigger? Well, it's a group of religious zealots ethnically cleansing a land to set up their own pseudo-religious empire. What does this sound like? This is us, right? This is what we've done. This is what we've done. So, by using this understanding of trauma, instead of treating white Americans as racist or fragile, it actually lets us bring the conversation down to the root of the problem. And this is really what I'm trying to do. This is really what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say we need to find a way to not just either soothe everything over or turn everything into an explosion. If we trigger white people, good, let's talk about it. Let's talk about this history. Let's talk about this nation. Let's talk about what we've done so that we can actually get some healing from it and find a way. Now, I'm very, very clear. White people are not victims of trauma. They experience trauma, but this is a perpetration-induced traumatic stress. So white people are not victims of trauma, but they still experience trauma. And I found this is one of the best tools I've developed to actually prevent white people from derailing the conversation. Now we're almost out of time, so I want to go into kind of my last two groups. The third group I want to talk to is Native peoples. My message to Native peoples is we are not the oppressive, we are not the helpless victims of an oppressive colonial government. We are the host people of the land. And our role is to step into, our job is to step into our role as the host. I love what happened at Standing Rock. Hundreds of tribes, thousands of Native peoples came together, committed to prayer, committed to the wisdom of our elders, committed to nonviolence, to teach this nation of undocumented immigrants. You can't drink oil. Water is life. I love what happened there, and I'm really on my message to them. My message to millennials, and this is the final group, and I don't have time to go really in depth into this. I went into it some during the Q&A today. My message to millennials is you are the group of people who are actually able you have the power to bring about some of this change. Believe it or not, you are the largest voting bloc in the country. You outnumber boomers. You are the most pluralistic generation this nation has ever seen. You have friends of different races, different religions, different gender definitions, and you believe in pluralism, and that's not a bad thing. The challenge is your parents and grandparents have been trying to make this nation Christian. But remember, Christian empire is a heresy. There's no such thing as Christian empire. The United States of America never has been, is not currently, nor will it ever be Christian. And so I love the fact that you're not trying to make the nation Christian. You share your faith, you talk about your faith, you believe what you believe, but you're not trying to force it upon everybody around you, and you let people have their own beliefs and their own way of life. And I think that this is what we need to do. In his final State of the Union, President Obama talked about, he said, "We the people." The Constitution begins with these three simple words we've come to recognize mean all the people. Now, this sounds beautiful, but we've never actually made this decision. Right? We've never decided we the people means all the people. The founding fathers didn't believe we the people meant all the people. Abraham Lincoln didn't believe we the people meant all the people. The civil rights movement didn't get us to we the people meaning all the people. President Trump doesn't believe we the people means all the people. We've never decided as a nation collectively, do we want to be a place where we the people actually means all the people? And I think millennials have the opportunity to bring us there. Because you understand pluralism better than any other generation before you. And so my challenge to millennials is to continue to press forward, continue to fight for these things, and move us in this direction. There's an Aboriginal leader named George Erasmus, and he says where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, he says you have to start by creating a common memory. I think this quote gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers the history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands, broken treaties, slavery, mass incarceration, Jim Crow laws, internment camps, boarding schools, and families separated at our borders. And there's no common memory. And I think this is something we have to stop talking about how great we are when we were great, how soon we can be great again. Let's start talking about what does it take to create this common memory to deal with our genocidal ethnic cleansing, dehumanizing past, and find a way to move forward so that we the people might actually mean all the people. I'm convinced this Truth and Conciliation Commission is one of our best ways to get this dialogue to the forefront. I am deeply committed to the work of having a nation where we the people actually means all the people. I invite you to go onto my website, and there's a TED Talk, a TEDx talk I gave about 3 months ago. It's called We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in American history. And it lays out some of the content I didn't have time to get to tonight about what are the challenges we face so that we the people might actually mean all the people. I have a lot of resources on my website. I'm on social media. I have a YouTube channel. I have a Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. I welcome you to connect with me, and I welcome you to work with me to try and bring this dialogue to the forefront so that we can begin to move this nation in a new direction. Thank you very much. It was an honor to be with you tonight.